Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Due to some violent content, parental discretion is advised.
Eye Opener Society is a podcast hosted by Hannah and Gary, a stepfather and stepdaughter team. We also are joined by Brittany on occasion too as a co-host. Our show does not conform to all the normal podcast stats, marketing, and editing. We are real, true, and raw. We discuss life as it happens with a hope of helping others along the way. We talk about life from a different perspective, using mindfulness as a base for solving problems. Our podcast strives to bring guidance through a crazy world. We also host podcasts within podcasts. So if you're into horoscopes and the tarot, we have Arcane Oracle podcast. If you're into government conspiracies, UFOs, the firmament, flat earth, we have Sunset Child's Out There podcast. And if you're into the haunted and spirits, pretty soon we're going to be bringing you Haunted and Waiting by Anne Lund. You can find us on all of your favorite platforms. Meditation, metaphysical mindfulness, and just real talk from real people, unedited and raw. Every Monday, a new episode is out for you to enjoy. We appreciate our listeners and hope to connect with you. Check us out. Give us a listen on all of your platforms. Thank you.
Welcome back to Twisted Tales, folks. Today's tale, nothing special. I was going to talk about some random ways that people died in the 1700s, how life was like, the way they lived, what other crazy shit I could find here. So let's travel back in time and get into some history of the 18th century. Now, the 18th century lasted from January 1st, 1701 to December 31st, 1801. Life expectancy varied by different regions. Now, in 2025, the average life expectancy in Canada is 83 years old. And the average life expectancy in the world is like 73 years old. So, even back in the day, think about it, life expectancy in England was, I believe, 25 to 40 years. In Prussia, you could live between the ages of 27 to 30. And if you were a kid over the age of 5, you were doing pretty awesome, because nearly 2/3 of children died before the age of 5. Now, typically most mothers had up to 8 children. This was in hopes that some would survive and be able to work for the family. If you were a woman back in those days, life expectancy was from between 15 years old to 33. Back then, the family lives of people were separated by 2 distinctions. There were roles for men versus roles for women, and social class. Now, in general, men were the breadwinners, providing income for the family. So breadwinner is a term for the primary or sole income earner in the household. So they contribute the largest portion. Generally cover most the household expenses and financially support the family. The mothers, they were mainly in charge of the household. They were responsible for running the household, managing the servants or what have you, if there were any. Women or mothers were also responsible for raising and educating their children. So in addition, they were responsible for cooking and feeding the family. So this required women to be well educated in medicinal and culinary practices. So they would use herbs and plants, do needlework, reading, writing. Mostly because female education was limited back then due to practical training for their domesticated roles. Most women back then were ill-treated by their male-dominated society, right? This was mostly due to the superiority of men and their ownership of women. It made women oppressed victims of society. So society just pretty much saw women as nothing but child bearers and homemakers, right? So that was their whole deal back then, right? Like the whole sole purpose of a woman's life back then was to find a husband, serve them, and then reproduce. Dating life for women in the 18th century kind of started to change here because they actually had a little bit more say in their marriages and their weddings and all that. Now, the average age a woman would start to marry was around 22 years old. Now, compared to decades before when the age was like much younger. Now, marriage was also very closely tied to social class. It also came with like heavy social implications for the family legacy and their reputation among their peers. So a little later on, women began to like just fight and defend their rights towards the end of the century. So obviously they got some pull. Now the importance of land, that was actually a big thing back then too. Now daughters sometimes posed a large problem for like land owning families, right? Because like other than widows, there weren't many women that owned land. Even though unmarried women were able to own their own properties and shit, like make contracts, all that, their rights were severely limited. All properties that women possessed before marriage had automatically became their husbands after they got married. And also, it was important for families to maintain a social status, which means a daughter was never married to someone of lower standing. Mothers and families actually spent time searching for like the best possible spouse for their child in order to benefit the family. But I mean, like, even for poor families, there wasn't really as much at stake when marrying. Now, it wasn't possible to transfer poverty to one another or lose like any kind of social status as a result of marrying. So men and women were free to choose who they wanted. So many of them lived in like one or two room houses that were often crowded with large families. Because back then, like, you'd have your lodgers that share their living space and everything, right? You try to get by. And a little earlier on, I mentioned life expectancy. So this refers to the number of years a person can expect to live. And it's just a hypothetical measure kind of thing. Now, this can be influenced by like a number of factors, including shit like, say, environmental conditions, like the physical, chemical, or biological factors that affect our surroundings. Like air quality, climate, extreme temperatures, shit like that. Because there were many ways to die back then, from like illnesses, accidents, executions were a big thing. In the 18th century, man, like, there were a lot of executions going on at that time. Hanging was actually the principal punishment for capital crimes, but I mean, there are other ways of capital punishment. There was like beheading, boiling, burning, different styles like that. But these were more so in the medieval period. And the hangings that we mentioned here, those became a big thing in the 1700s, so they kind of took over, right? Death by boiling was a method of execution in which a person is killed by being immersed in a boiling liquid. This involves a large container of heated liquid, say like water, oil, or molten lead, wax, tallow, even wine. So, what happens here is the convicted prisoner is placed in this until he's dead. It was more so practiced in the parts of like Europe and Asia back in the day, but it's just an extremely painful method of torture. Now, during the reign of Roman Emperor Nero, thousands of Christians were boiled in oil. Death was just formally the penalty for like a large number of offenses back then. I mean, especially over in like England in the 17th and 18th centuries and stuff, right? But it was never applied as widely as the law provided. Now, boiling alive is obviously an extremely painful method of execution. I mean, executions of this type were carried out using a large vessel such as like a cauldron or like a sealed kettle. And yeah, sometimes it could be hooked onto like a hook and pulley system as well. Now, in the year 1675, a Sikh martyr called Bey Dali, he was boiled to death in Delhi after he refused to convert to Islam. So he was put into a cauldron of like cold water, which was then heated to a boiling point, and he was actually boiled along with his guru and a couple other of his religious friends. So this guy was born in Brahim within the Hindu society. So he was doing his priesthood at like Hindu temples and different ceremonies and stuff like that, right? So he was doing priesthood at like Hindu temples and different ceremonies and stuff like that, performing his rite of passage rituals. So Ba Dolly. He was a highly respected figure in Sikh history, symbolizing like firm faith and sacrifice and all that. So he was raised in a devout Sikh family. And then he deeply rooted teachings of the gurus here from a young age. So he was taught the importance of courage, devotion, God, all that, right? So obviously, like as you're young, you're learning this. This is going to be instilled early on. So I mean, this will strongly shape this dude's identity, right? But his commitment eventually led him to being closely associated with Guru Teg Bahadur. This guy was like the ninth Sikh guru. So as he became close, this relationship was based on like a shared commitment to the teachings and mutual understanding of the importance of spreading these teachings around. So this dude traveled with his entourage here, traveling exclusively with the guru. And this whole thing was more than just like a follower guru kind of relationship, right? It was actually like a partnership into like true spirit and shit. These guys rolled with a couple others here, and they were going to go out to spread the word. So eventually, when they did, they were actually arrested on the orders of the Emperor Aurangzeb. So, this guy was the sixth Mughal emperor. He reigned from 1658 until his death in 1707. So, at the time, under the emperor, there was a significant push to convert various religious groups to Islam. Now, this guy here, he belonged to the branch of the Timurid dynasty. So he held a bunch of like military posts and shit under the reign of his father. So he had some power behind him, I guess. This policy affected numerous communities who were particularly known for their firm commitment to their faith. So the Sikh community, they were like becoming prime targets due to their growing influence and their refusal to renounce their beliefs. So why would they quit one thing that they believe in to go fucking believe in something that somebody else believes in, right? Now, the efforts to convert them, it didn't work. So what this guy did, he ruled by homogenizing the religious landscape of his empire. So they found him, and Bey was murdered in Shandy Chowk, and he refused to convert to Islam, so they arrested him and his buddies, and then they set him up for execution. So the arrest of Bey Abdallah and others was like a direct consequence of their refusal to give in to the demands for conversion. Now their stand was not just about maintaining like the personal faith or anything like that, like it more so represented like a significant protest against the violation of religious freedom and the right to practice one's religion. Their defiance was a courageous stand against the religious persecution spearheaded by an oppressive regime. So one of this guy's buddies, Bey Sadi Das, he was executed at Kotwali. This is like a police station in the Chandni Chowk area of Delhi. So this guy was executed by means of being wrapped in cotton wool, soaked in oil, and then he was set on fire. Now, Bey Adalia, he was tied up with an iron chain-like bundle here. He was made to stand erect in a big cauldron full of water, with only his head and his shoulders seen. The vessel was then heated up to a boiling point, and he knew he was going to die. He started singing Japji. This is like one of the 5 daily prayers. Now, Jap means to repeat, and Ji means soul. So the repetition of Japji gives you consistent projection and allows you to access your own infinite source of inspiration and depth. Because each stanza actually explores different aspects of like spirituality, philosophy, and the nature of reality. And this guy was just roasted into a block of charcoal here, and they killed this dude. I mean, that sure seems like the nature of reality, right? So when the human body gets to like 42 degrees Celsius, it starts to cook. So the heat caused by the proteins in each cell to irreversibly change. Kind of like an egg white as it boils, right? Even before that, like your brain can shut down because of the lack of the blood coming from like an overworked, overheated heart. Your muscles stop working, the stomach cramps, and the mind becomes delirious, and then death, obviously, soon follows. So next up, Julien Offray de la Mettrie. So this dude here was like this big physician there. So he was born November 23rd, 1709, up in Saint Malo, France. So this guy here was the son of a textile merchant. Now, this is like one who buys and sells textiles and textile products, stuff like that. They also have like a couple other nicknames here. They're like cloth merchants or haberdashers. So, there's some info for you. He grew up in St. Malo. This is a walled city on the English Channel coast. So it has like a population of over 47,000. Now, he went to school, and originally he had plans on being like a clergyman. That's actually like a male priest or some sort of religious leader or what have you. But he later on set his sights in medical education. Now, after some persuasion from a buddy, he took that up, and then he went to France. So he did this for like a 5-year period under the mentorship of a man named Francois Joseph Hunod. So this is where this guy got his like teachings and shit. So Julian settled down afterwards in his home region to study like medical practice and stuff. He got married in 1739. He had 2 kids. Then the marriage kind of dwindled and he fucked off to Paris and he left his family. So once he got over here, he worked as a surgeon to the Gardes Françaises regiment. So then he fought in like several battles during the War of the Austrian Succession. So a little bit about this. This was a European conflict fought between the years of 1740 and 1748. This was up in Central Europe, the Austrian Netherlands, the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and Italy. The immediate cause of this war was the death of Emperor Charles VI, born 1685, and he died 1740. This dude was like a Holy Roman Emperor and the ruler of Austrian Habsburg monarchy. So, this dude's eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, had assumed the throne, but her succession was actually challenged by a bunch of her relatives. Now, they were all from like Prussia, France, Bavaria, Spain. A lot of these relatives here were actually just pissed off about the whole ordeal, right? So they were causing a big ruckus about it, and because there were other people that wanted to be in power as well. All of this stuff came because of her succession after his death, so this is why the whole war had started. Now, Julian didn't really have a good time over here. The whole experience left him with like a deep aversion to violence, which kind of went into his writings. So he would like write about all this stuff. An aversion to violence is like the opposite of desensitization to violence, which is when someone becomes less reactive to violence. So later on in life, this dude was thrown a little shindig here of a celebration. So this was thrown at him by the French ambassador to Prussia. So Julian helped this guy with an illness, and he wanted to kind of show his kindness, right? Now, at the whole event here, like, there was a bunch of food going on. Julian had ended up scarfing down like a whole bunch of food during all of this festivities, right? He didn't give a fuck. He was like right on, right? So this guy killed like a large quantity of pate de Phasian ox trough. It's like a pheasant ground meat, kind of like truffle or pie kind of deal. Well, this can be prepared with like different meats, say poultry, venison, eel, sheep's tongue, bacon, other such divine luxuries, right? Even the term pate, like that kind of came to designate any blended meat cooked in pastry. So this guy here killed a bunch of these pies. Now, as a result, he developed a gastric illness of some sort, and then he began suffering like a wicked severe fever, and then he died. So I'm sure like he had some sort of health issues before this guy dived in and ate a bunch of things that he probably shouldn't have. And then he fucking died after overeating at a feast that was given in his honor. This was up in Berlin, Germany on November 11th, 1751, and he died at the age of 41. I just kind of thought this was a cool little tale to add in there. A friend of his had said he was merry, a good devil, a good doctor, and a very bad author. By not reading his books, one can be very content. And he later went on to mention about his death that he had suffered from indigestion caused by overindulging in the pheasant paste. And then this dude left behind a wife. Her name was Louise Charlotte Dreno. And then a 5-year-old daughter. Yeah, this is what I mean by like crazy deaths in the whole 18th century. It's pretty fascinating, right? But friends recall that this dude was a good man, very wise physician, and life went on. And even back then, like, it's gotta be a tough go. I mean, people just fucking die from weird things. Now, next up, I got a guy named George Wilhelm Richmond. So this guy was born Sunday, July 22nd, 1770. Now, he was born in Pärnu in Livonia, the Swedish Empire. Actually, it's now known as Estonia. This is a country in Europe with a population over 1.366 million. Now, it's a little known fact that Pärnu is the fourth largest city in Estonia. Now, this fella here was a Russian physicist, so he specialized in the field of physics, obviously. So this kind of encompasses the interaction of matter and energy in a physical universe. So the study theory goes that, these guys design shit and then they use what they learned from that to develop new materials and equipment. Even the study of physics and mathematics over there in Russia, like, it's given like wicked high priority, right? Like the Russian education, it's fucking bar none. Now this guy's homeland was subsequently subsumed by the Russian Empire by a guy named Peter the Great. And Richmond ended up fucking moving to St. Petersburg. So he took his schooling at the Russian Academy of Sciences, then eventually he became a professor of physics at the Academy and director of the physics cabinet. So a little backstory here. In 1752, Benjamin Franklin in the American colonies asserted not only that lightning is an electrical phenomenon, but that an experiment could demonstrate the truth of his supposition. So what they were going to do is stick a metal rod up in a storm and then see if one can charge a Leyden jar from the clouds. So they were indicating that lightning is electrical. Now, a Leyden jar is like the first device that was invented to hold electricity, like acquire an electric charge, I should say. Now, the experiment was done successfully at Marly-la-Ville in France in May of 1752, because the sparks are actually drawn from the rod. And obviously Richmond wanted to do this himself too, I mean, just so that he could use his electrometer to measure the force of the atmospheric electricity. So he set up an iron rod in his house, connected to a wire, this is on the roof, and then with an electrometer mounted on the iron rod. So August 6th, 1753, a thunderstorm had moved in. So Richmond noticed this from the academy here, so he ended up taking off, and he took another buddy with him here. This was the academy's engraver. So this guy was like gonna record some stuff here, and it would be good to have another person there, right? Just to do the experiment, have a witness type deal. So as the storm gathered, Richmond had his eye on the electrometer. The engraver saw like a small batch of lightning leap from the bar to Richmond's forehead, and this sent him like soundlessly to the floor. And then an explosion happened that scattered things around the room. And the engraver just ended up running for help as soon as a fire started. And Mrs. Richmond had ran in and she found her husband dead. I mean, the other guy said he was kind of just stunned or whatever, right? He was in a panic. He didn't know he was dead, but shit happens. And Richmond was the first fatal victim of electrical investigation. Now, several weeks after the incident, a letter was written by someone at the academy announcing like the circumstances of Richmond's death and shit, right? Because all these guys knew him, right? He was a pretty high top dude. So several weeks after the incident, there was a letter written by one of his buddies here at the academy. So he announced the whole circumstances about Richmond's death. I'll read some of this letter for you guys here, just to give you guys a little bit of full detail on the incident, because it was actually reported by his apprentice, right? So we'll get into this. Goes, on the 6th of August, towards noon, Richmond had prepared for making electrical observations, or the means for averting the effects of thunder, according to the method practiced by Mr. Franklin of Philadelphia. With him was M. Sokola, engraver to the academy. The place that he did this experiment at had the entrance towards the north, a window towards the south. Whether the window was open, it's not known. All that is certain, that near the window was a cupboard 4 feet long, on which were placed the electrical needle and a vessel of water partly filled with brass fillings, over which came an iron bar about an inch thick and a foot long. It was fastened at the top to a wire, which came down from the roof of the house through the gallery door. The professor, judging from the needle that the tempest was a great distance, he assured Mr. Sokola that there was no danger, but there might be at the approach. Now, Richmond stood about a foot from the bar, and he was just observing the needle. So Sokola saw the machine being untouched, and then a globe of blue whitish fire about 4 inches in diameter dart from the bar against Richmond's forehead, which he then fell backwards and didn't say a word. This was succeeded by an explosion, and this threw Sokola down on the floor. So it kind of felt like he had some blows on his back, and this was actually from the wire that was breaking. Some bits had actually hit him in behind and actually started marking up and burning his clothes. So before this guy recovered, he got up and leaned against the cupboard. He directed his eyes over to Richmond. He thought this guy was just knocked out or stunned, right? So when he looked over and seen him there, he also noticed there was a thick black smoke, so it was kind of going over him here. So he ran out to call the picket guard, and then Mrs. Richmond had heard the whole noise, and she ended up coming in. She found the place full of smoke, and then she saw her husband stretched out on his back without any sign of life. So she did what she could to recover the guy or whatever, and yeah, nothing helped. They went and got a surgeon here. Then a vein was opened out of the top, which only came a single drop of blood. Then the doctor several times kind of blew into his breast as an unusual practice on suffocated persons, and this had no effect. So there was no pulse, there was no sign of any convulsion or anything in his body. His left shoe was torn in 2 places in the same side without any marks of burning. There were a bunch of little spots all over his body here. I believe there were 8 spots. They were red and blue here, and it kind of looked like they were caused by gunpowder, but it was all the electricity. A piece of the door had been blown off over to the stairwell, and the glass vessel was broke off at about half its height here. Even some of the brass fillings and everything that it was filled with, like wire and everything, were just scattered about. Now the next day, upon opening the body, it was observed that the spots of blood were dried and hardened. They noticed this guy's skin was a bit raised. They checked out his brain here. Everything else was perfectly good with that. Part of his lungs here was in a natural situation. They also checked him out and noticed that his heart wasn't damaged. In the cavity of the breast was about a half pound of pure blood. The intestines were sound and in good condition. Pancreas hurt and was full of blood. Now, the liver, the spleen, all that was perfectly sound. But just the accident itself just fucking killed him, right? A bunch of electricity went through him. And it just sucks that, this guy just died from trying to learn something that interested him, right? I mean, what a fucking shocking experience that must have been. The 1700s were just fucking wild back then. I mean, just a bunch of crazy shit going on, right? There was somebody that died there. Fuck, I believe huge thing of pig bacon fell on them there. They had it all hung up and whatever. This was actually the first recorded death by bacon. This happened in 1543. So there was an English servant named Elizabeth Brown. So she was warming herself by a fire here when the bacon that was hung from the pig had fell on her. It was hanging by a bunch of hooks, and it crushed her. And I know this is a little before the whole period and whatever, but I figured this should be included. There were also tons of diseases and everything back then too. I mean, fuck, there was a Corynebacterium diphtheria. Say that 10 times fast. So this caused over 1,000 deaths among people between 1735 and 1736. Pretty big number for a 1-year period. 90% of those deaths occurred in children under the age of 10. Then the numbers continued to rise over the next little while, and then the whole thing became dubbed the title of Plague Among Children. It had a few other names too, like canker, throat distemper, rattles, just to name a few. But I mean, it was widely known as Plague Among Children. So what this disease is, a bacterial infection that affects the upper respiratory tract. And this can all be transmitted by coughing and sneezing and spreading germs like that. So it doesn't take long for fucking diseases to spread back then. Now, before the invention of vaccinations in 1796, People had very few ways to protect themselves from disease. There were no advancements of modern medicine, right? So many that contracted illnesses more so just proved fatal to them. They died. So smallpox was caused by the microscopic variola virus. It's very contagious, meaning it spread from one person to another. Now the infected would catch a fever and very distinctive progressive skin rash. The smallpox virus was one of the deadliest diseases in the 18th century. It was likely brought to the colonies by the British immigrants or African slaves being brought over on boats, and the virus would spread through the air and prove to be deadly since it can take about 2 weeks for the affected person to show symptoms. Now this allows the virus to spread rapidly. Symptoms of smallpox include like fever, headache, back pain, vomiting. You can get pus-filled blisters. Many smallpox survivors have permanent scars over large areas of their body, especially their faces. Some victims are left totally blind. Now, once the blisters are healed up, scabs can form, and once they fall off the body, pitted scars are left behind, and this actually takes some time to fade away. Unknown at the time, those who contracted and survived the virus had gained immunity, and then they could not contract it again. Now, point in case, in 1751, George Washington contracted smallpox while he was up in Barbados, and he actually got ill for an entire month, but he survived. So smallpox even impacted the Continental Army severely during the Revolutionary War, so much that George Washington mandated inoculation for all Continental soldiers back in 1777. Now, the process of inoculation involved taking a scab that had fallen off a smallpox patient and then rubbing it into a cut on a healthy patient's arm. So the patient would get sick, but not as sick as contracting the virus naturally, and once they recovered, they would be immune to the disease. Now, the last natural outbreak of smallpox occurred in 1949 in the USA. Now, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox eradicated back in 1980. And although smallpox is done with, it is possible that variola virus could be used to like a biological attack. I mean, if that does happen and there is a smallpox outbreak, then health officials would actually just use the smallpox vaccines to control the whole thing. Now, even during the French and the Indian War, British forces used smallpox as a biological weapon to weaken the indigenous tribes that assisted the French. That went on from 1754 to 1763. So next up, we'll talk about the hanging of Ruth Blay. She was born June 10th, 1737, and she died December 30th, 1768. Ruth was a school teacher executed in 1768 for concealing the stillborn birth of her illegitimate child. This was by the province of New Hampshire. So, this was the last female executed in New Hampshire. And it's a little known fact that New Hampshire hasn't executed anyone since 1939. So Ruth, she lived with the Currier family. This is up in Southampton. So she made claims to them that her husband was away traveling, which everybody believed, but she didn't have a husband. Blay was a school teacher. Her classes would have been held around like the local homes around the area here. This was because no permanent schoolhouse existed at that time. So she traveled between what was then the towns of Sandown, Chester, and Hawk. And she was the youngest daughter to 5 of her family. Now she was put to work as soon as she could. Her mother was a tailor, and she actually passed down her sewing skills to her daughter. So she's believed to have taught school until February or March of 1768, up until her death. So one night here, she found herself on the floor of the barn on her 31st birthday. And obviously she's young, she's afraid, I mean the father's nowhere in sight, and it's totally all her doing this. Now the baby was delivered on June 10th, 1768. A few mornings later, some of her students came into the barn due to a bad smell coming from the inside. Now, the child was found under the floorboards of the barn. So when Ruth was questioned about this, she didn't deny that the child was hers. When police got involved and everything, they said that she would need to be examined for a recent birth, and then she told them that there'd be no need because the baby was hers and the child was dead at birth. Now, when men came to perform the autopsy on the body, it's already been 3 days later. The baby was examined and found to be born with bruises from that of a difficult birth. So obviously you're giving birth alone in a fucking farmhouse. There's going to be some stuff that doesn't go right. She wasn't accused of killing the baby, but for hiding the premature birth. No, she did not kill the child or have any intent to kill the child, examiners said. She made preparations for the child's birth. Ruth Blay ultimately admitted to wrapping her stillborn baby in a quilt and then hiding it under the floorboards of the barn in Southampton. And it is more likely that some people, like close friends and stuff, knew of her pregnancy. And she probably just like made dresses covering up her growing belly and everything, right? Like she could fix her clothes a certain way, right? You know, making dresses, letting it out of the back and stuff like that. Now, she was also a product of an affair out of wedlock. So, also fearing that the public kind of would scorn her, there'd be scrutiny, all that. She did what she did. And not long after, she was sentenced by an all-male jury and condemned for what they called her evil ways. Now, at the time, the law stated that the concealment of a bastard child, whether or not it survived birth, was a capital crime, punishable by hanging. And soon enough, Ruth Blay stood at the gallows. This is a wooden structure used to hang criminals. Now, these were built in like many ways, actually. They had permanent ones. These were like more so built in prisons, or like they build them up on a hill and then bring the criminals to that location. They made temporary gallows. Now they can move these fuckers around, kind of put them away for later use and stuff, right? So they used these for like pirates. They would put these in the ocean when it was low tide, then hang the pirates and then leave them up to get splashed around by the waves and shit, right? So they were never taken down. And they also built portable ones. These were like just quick ones. Like if there were ever like a few charged with a crime, they could build multiple ones with one rope each. I believe they had like the longest guy swinging on here for like a total of 40 minutes here. Didn't break his neck or anything there. He just fucking strangled himself for about 40 minutes there. Now, there were also ones that had a horse and a cart. Now, that was a way of hanging. They put the noose around the neck and then hang it up and then driving the cart away. This leaves the person dangling by the neck to slowly strangle. And later, actually, they kind of upped this here, upgraded or what have you. They added a scaffold with a trap door. So this was more so used so victims dropped down and died quickly from a broken neck, rather than strangulation. Sometimes for shits and giggles they would add extra weights tied down to their ankles so they'd fucking die quicker, right? Blay spent her last night writing a statement in the presence of 3 witnesses. She was sitting shackled in the prison where she was kept for the previous 5 months, and then she stated her innocence until the very end. The next morning, she was taken to jail on Prison Lane. This was by a horse-drawn carriage, and then she was driven up to the hill. Now, it's a little known fact, Prison Lane is actually now called Chestnut Street, so a couple name changes. Apparently, there's somewhere where the streets have names. Now, on December 30th, 1768, Ruth Blay was hanged in Portsmouth South Street Cemetery for the whole hiding the baby ordeal. She struggled for several minutes, died in agony, and then the noose failed to snap her neck, so she swung around for a bit. Now, some say that Ruth Blay was a victim of her time. Others say that she was a victim of her gender, upper class, upper laws, time, all that. Her life ended before a crowd of thousands. Now, back then, there was no fucking television or anything at that time, so this was their entertainment. Now, families flocked to what's now known as Old South Cemetery to see her hang. So that's what they did. They fucking had an execution. They'd have tons of people over. Yeah, it's just a big thing back then. Now, in the following decades, Ruth's story became more so folk legend. Many believed her to be innocent. Now, one of her students, Betsy Pettingill, she had been among the school students who had found Blais's child. Now, they believed Blais was not guilty, and later the kid said that Blais was more so sinned against than sinning. A few years ago, they started planning a memorial to Ruth, and then they did this whole day of programming shit. So this was called Friends of Ruth Blais. This was founded in March of 2021, and the mural of Ruth had been unveiled a few years ago, so they kind of made this whole memorial thing for her. The Ruth Blais Inc. is a New Hampshire nonprofit corporation, just raises awareness for justice issues and stuff around the Portsmouth community. The father of her child is still unknown. Blais took that to her grave. Now, he might have been a married man or even another school teacher, who knows, but she never said anything about him. So, obviously, it was most likely an affair, and then she didn't want him to get in trouble. Another thing here, women who were sentenced to be hung would wear fine attire. This was in hopes to please God upon the entrance going in, hoping they would be let into heaven and shit. Now, there is no recorded information on what she wore that day. It's actually unknown what Blais looked like because there was no information about her features at that time. There were a couple newspaper clippings here stated that she was begging for a few more moments to live before they hung her. Now, her body was buried by a couple workers not far from the base of the hill where she was hung. But there's no marker for the site. And at the time of her death, the area was actually not a cemetery. It was like a military training area. So they changed it up a little bit there, but what do you do? And there are a couple tales here that surround her death, too. At one account, Blais is said to have seen the ghost of her dead baby sitting on the windowsill of the home that she was in during her house arrest portion before she moved to a jail cell. And two, another says that the sheriff hung her early so he could go home and have dinner because he didn't want to be late. And the quilt that she used to wrap up her stillborn child is actually up in the Portsmouth Historical Society. And that's our little story about Ruth Blais. I guess we'll continue on here with a couple more. So next up, James Aitken, also known as John the Painter, also known as James Hill, aka John Boswell. And these were just a few aliases that this guy went by. So he was born in Edinburgh on September 28th, 1752. So he went to school up until the age of 14, and then he became an apprentice painter. So he tried this for a little bit, but he more so dabbled in being a petty thief. But at some point, he did join up in the Army Commission. This was just for a bit, and then he became a journeyman, and this went well for a little while. Eventually, he got into some debt, and then he slipped into the criminal underworld so he could make a quick buck. So highwayman is a robber who stole from travelers, usually traveled by horse and did his robbing by horse, like he would catch up to the stagecoaches and everything and then steal their money and take off. Now, they usually worked in groups, or sometimes they did this just alone, and highwaymen increased in number in the early 18th century, so they targeted stagecoaches, like carriages, farmers that will be returning from market with their produce and stuff like that, mail coaches, other things like that. Now, highwaymen were usually armed with pistols, and they wore masks. Now, they actually coined the phrase stand and deliver. Now, this means stop and hand over your valuables. When the highwaymen were on the scene, all it took was a look at their pistols to know that they meant business. So people just gave up their valuables without giving much hassle. So Aiken continued on robbing and committing his crimes, and he was doing this at a steady pace. So he gained a lot of notoriety. So eventually, he had his wanted poster slapped up everywhere, and everywhere he went, he would see this, so he decided to lay low. Now, eventually, Aiken had negotiated an indenture in exchange for a voyage over to Jamestown, Virginia. So he signed off as an indentured servant, and he shipped out to the colonies. So the work he did here was like slave-like labor, and then he did this in the fields. Eventually, he escaped his master in 1775, and then immediately got shipped back to Europe. So an indenture is where a person agrees to work for another person for a set period of time, or until a debt is paid. And indentured workers could be forced to work in exchange for like a reduced sentence or what have you. Indentured labor was used more so in the American South, the West Indies, and Southeast Asia. Now, John the Painter had no intention of caring about his whole working his fucking reduced sentence kind of thing, so he soon escaped up to North Carolina. He took aim at determining how to destroy royal dockyards around the country. So he was doing this in order to cripple the Royal Navy during the American War of Independence, and he wanted to ensure that America was victorious. Shortly after, he ended up traveling on over to France. So what he did over here is he created a design for a time-delayed bomb, and then he made several, and he put these up in Canterbury. This is the city in Kent, England, about 470 miles away from France. Aiken wasn't this whole criminal mastermind or anything like that, but he did know a couple things. He actually used his training of painting, like when he was mixing chemicals and paint solvents and shit. He used that to kind of decipher into his bombs and stuff, so good for him. Now, at one time, he attempted to light one of these bombs off in a rope house up in Portsmouth Docks. This is December 7th, 1776. He was only partially successful at doing this, though. He managed to set fire to the building. Unfortunately, his plans were foiled because the quick thinking of a few remaining workers actually put out the blaze here, so it was brought under control. So as this guy was taking off, he ended up having a little mishap. He ended up getting locked inside one of the rope houses. Now, a rope house is where you go to store rope for use around the docks and stuff like that. He ended up pounding on the door until somebody opened up. Kind of bullshitted his way out of the whole situation about how he got locked in there. Ha ha ha, I'll see you later. And a couple days afterwards, he went up to the Bristol area and they burned some stuff up that way. All these little attacks that were going on were giving folk the idea that a band of saboteurs were on the loose over in England. At about 3:30 p.m. on Saturday, December 7th, Aiken had taken some of his homemade bombs with him here, put him in a rope house, and he slipped away. Guess he didn't lock himself in there this time around. Plus, doing this whole little operation a little earlier in the day, this would ensure that there would be plenty of dock hands in the vicinity to contain the fire to one building here, because they were gonna set fire to one and then blow up another thing. This also meant that the tide would be in a little earlier. Now, there was a brig nearby. It had 2,000 pounds of gunpowder. This could easily be put out to sea if the alarms went up or whatever, right? But I mean, if nobody caught on, fire would spread, this whole thing would go up, right? And yards in this era were just fucking chock full of wood. I mean, there were wood ships, wood buildings. You had flammable materials lying all around. It would just be hard to fucking decipher an accidental fire from a sabotage attack is all, right? But I mean, with all these little attacks going on and they were being more frequent, people were kinda on the lookout, right? Even members of Parliament had made mention about this whole attacks and the malice and everything going on. Now, after all this here, John the Painter was still gaining notoriety around, right? He was helping the American side out, but he actually had an ulterior motive. He thought by doing these deeds and helping, then he would be paid handsomely when it was over, for his part in all this shit, right? With this guy's explosive adventures going strong, a reward poster was made up, and they actually offered up $1,000 for the arrest of the man known as John the Painter. Now, his description was put together by like a few people that remembered a suspicious person at the docks, and it even got back to people that the whole rope house incident here, Buddy ended up locking himself in there and they let him go. They actually found out that that was a saboteur. So, he blew his cover when they fucking let him out anyway, so now they just had his description and stuff. So, it wouldn't take long for the word to spread and people to keep their eyes peeled for anything suspicious, especially going down to the docks. Sometime later, after a semi-successful attempt to burn down both Plymouth and the Bristol docks, another device of his was discovered intact elsewhere around the Portsmouth yard. So this kind of sealed this dude's fate here, right? They're like, fuck, we got this whole bomb here now, so we just gotta find out who owns it, or who can build these things. So they asked around town if anybody knew who made the makeshift devices, and, people were giving info the best that they could and whatever, right? And soon enough, his description actually circulated, and his crimes were published in a newspaper called The Hue and Cry. Originally, this was the Police Gazette. This was established back in 1772 and actually ceased publication in 2017. So there's some facts for you. Now, upon his travels, he was arrested at the Raven Inn up in Hook. This is up in northeast Hampshire. So then he was remanded at Odiham Gaol. This is a village and civil parish in the Hart District of Hampshire. Now, his trial took place in the Great Hall up in Winchester on March 6th. Aiken pleaded not guilty, as he didn't think they had anything too concrete against him. But somebody who had worked with him prior actually backstabbed him. They fucked him over. They gave up a bunch of information on him here and shared some info and stuff. And this didn't help his case. And then he was sentenced to death, and he was taken back to Portsmouth. Now, this was on March 10th, 1777. He was executed by hanging from the mizzenmast of the docked HMS Arethusa. Now, somebody that he had worked with had fucked him over. They gave him up and they shared a bunch of info on him, which didn't help his case. And then he was sentenced to death, and he was taken back to Portsmouth. This is on March 10th, 1777. He was executed by hanging from the mizzenmast of the docked HMS Arethusa. This is a French frigate, meaning like a warship. It actually launched in 1757 during the 7 Years' War. Now it was captured by the Royal Navy in 1759, then became the fifth-rate HMS Arethusa. Now, what they did here was they removed this and they set it up on land so they could hang the enemy of the Navy outside the walls of the damaged Portsmouth dockyard. So British authorities did this, and they hung him. So they took everything apart and the mast was struck from the ship. It was re-erected at the dockyard entrance, so they could have as many people as possible watching this execution. Actually, it was the highest gallows ever used in an execution in England, and I believe some 20,000 people reportedly witnessed the hanging. And his body, they just fucking hung it up there. They kept it up. This was suspended in chains for many years at the Fort Blockhouse. So this was overlooking the Portsmouth Harbor, and it just rotted away. So they kept him there, and now he's all dead. But his memory still continues to live on and everything. So what he did for the country and everything else. And I hope you guys really enjoyed this tale here. Just a little bit about 18th century stuff, so there's lots going on back in that century. So thank you very much for tuning in to Twisted Tales. Have a good day.
Twisted Tales.